Hello, animators and artists. Seth Lanki is a character designer, rigging artist, and 2D animator located in British Columbia. His past roles include working with Relish Studios, Copernicus Studios, and Yeti Farm. Recently, Seth shared a clip of a D&D-inspired Raven Wizard Fetchin, which he designed, rigged, and animated. So we invited Seth onto our live stream to discuss his work as well as take us on a tour of Fetchin's rig. So, Seth, welcome to the Toon Boom's live stream.
Hey, Mike. Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Thank you so much for joining us. So, to start, can you tell us a little bit about the different hats that you wear? Because character design, rigging, and animation are very different disciplines. So how did you wind up working in all three?
Yeah, I mean, I will say I've never worked in all of them at the same time. Really, it's kind of been just moving around as I've gone through my career. I started out in animation, and then on the side, I would kind of just rig my own characters. And one day, one of the supervisors at the studio kind of noticed, and they tapped me on the shoulder, and they're like, "Oh, hey, Seth, we noticed you do rigs, and uh, we actually have a production coming up that is going to need some more rigging talent. And if you're interested, we would love to bring you on for that." And I said yes to that, not really having any clue how rigs were built for full TV production. Um, so they brought me on for that, and it was really throwing me in the deep end. Like, just doing rigs on my own was kind of one thing, and then doing it for a TV production where it's not just you handling the rig anymore, it's like a team of 20 or 30 animators. Really changed my outlook on how that process worked. And I did that for a number of years and started to get pretty proficient at it, where felt more comfortable building a character that I knew was going to be sufficient for whatever the production needed. Um, and then design wise, kind of fell into that by accident. At my most recent job, we had a hiatus during a production, and they kind of looked at me and they're like, "Oh, well, Seth can draw, so maybe he's interested in doing some design work." So they brought me onto the project to do some designs, and kind of gave me a crash course on how to design characters for a production. And I think the fun thing with each of those is when you're actually doing it for uh, a TV show or a video game, the full production. You really learn a lot about how to make things more efficient for yourself in your workflow. You can't be too precious. You just have to make things work, get them out there, get feedback, do the notes, and then get it approved.
I just want to rewind a little bit. So you were working in a studio. You were like between shots, sort of like animate, like rigging your own characters. Where did you learn to rig?
Yeah, that's a good point. I originally learned when I was in college. I went to Van Arts, um, and they kind of just did a, a generalist kind of course on how to animate and how to rig in Toon Boom. So I kind of learned a little bit in school, and then continued to do it while I was working professionally afterwards.
So I'm a big believer that like people who experience like different roles in animation, it's really an advantage. So how does your experience with rigging an animation influence your approach to character design?
Yeah, it's a good question. I feel like it's kind of a balance because most of the time you don't get to have any say in the design. So when it is your own character design that you'll be rigging, um, still want to put the character first and foremost, and be true to the design that you've been given. I think the main thing that I always just try and consider is how it's going to function as a rig. So there will be things um, I try not to put details right on a joint, because when the animator is going to be bending that joint hundreds of times, like it's going to be really annoying to have to like move that detail and make it work around like the elbow or the knee. So little things like that matter a lot. And then there's just like stuff that I know animators hate, like putting plaid and stripes on a character isn't ever a good idea. I've done it like, or I've had
Yeah.
designs given to me with a character like fully in plaid, and yeah, it sucks. So you try and like avoid that as much as possible. Sometimes it's
Eh,
just like part of the
there are ways
story.
to work around it, right? Like the
There's
freeform
workarounds.
deformers, or
Yeah,
like just deciding, that the plaid's going to be stationary.
yeah.
Two things that you can do to sort of get around it. But yeah, those stripes patterns tend to be more difficult.
Honestly, the freeform deformer had like just come out when I had to do that rig, and yeah, it saved my life because like before it would have been much more challenging, and like yeah, you just end up hearing like animators complaining from you afterwards, like yeah,
Yeah, or you're on a production that is not on the latest version yet, and it's like, okay, well, it's good
yeah,
that I know that exists, but I can't use that right now.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah, so I was also curious too, like as a animator and rigging artist, are there other things in character designs that you think about, or that maybe you wish, like, if I was the character designer, I might have changed this a little bit?
yeah. It's usually like simplifying stuff. I find
Hmm.
the characters that I enjoy rigging the most have like a good balance of like they're simple, like they're gonna be fun to animate, but they still like are thinking about the character and like including details that are important to show like who this character is, like their personality. Um, the designs that I like kind of roll my eyes at or just like really um yeah, just get tired of like immediately are the ones where it's like they've thrown in so many details that aren't necessary.
Ah,
They just yeah. Sometimes like more adult animation is guilty of that. Like and the yeah, those rigs are um a bit more of a headache for sure.
yeah, in traditional animation, there's a concept called line mileage, where like
Yeah.
the more you have to draw, the longer it takes to animate a character, and it applies as well to like rigged characters, where if they just have a ton of elements that you need to move around, um, if you have the same budget, that means less animation.
Yeah. Yeah, and you see that, like, you'll have, like, a really detailed design, goes to rigging. The rigging kinda suffers because you can't do as much to make it, like, more efficient. Then animation gets it, and they have to, like, try and make all these details work. So they just, like, cut down on, like, how much animation they can do, and then the end result just, like, looks worse than if you, like, started at the beginning in the design phase and, like, made it more, um, considerate of, like, the end result and like what you're after. Um, so yeah, it's always a balancing act. I try to like stay true to what the design is at the beginning because there's been productions where I knew it was going to be hard in rigging, but the designs were really beautiful, so it was going to be worth it. Like I worked on a show called Pete the Cat. Every character had like textures on everything. And textures like even in harmony can be challenging. There's ways around it, but we had to figure out this whole workflow to make the textures work so that like when their arms moved, the textures weren't clipping in a weird way. And we found a way to rig the characters where the textures looked nice on the puppets, and then the end result like stayed true to the original like concept art, which I was really proud of.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, like, you run into things where, like, if you're stretching 2D assets at the end of the day, like, you're stretching 2D assets, and um, there's only so much they can do to sort of hide the fact that it is like, you know, 2D characters that are not actually made of felt.
Mhm.
But I do think that, like, there are really interesting techniques that people do to work around it and find solutions. So, Seth, the character I wanted to ask you about today for this live stream is Fetchin, the Raven Wizard that you posted a clip of on LinkedIn. What can you tell our audience about Fetchin and the goal that you had in mind when designing the character?
Yeah, I'll kind of like walk through some of the art as I talk about it. Um, Fetchin like originally just started as like a character for me to build and animate myself because like you work on so many production rigs and then the production wraps and like you can never touch them again. They're just like gone into the ether. I wanted to have like a really solid production quality rig of my own that I could, make stuff with. And then I just like from my personal life was getting really into D&D and thought like, oh, wouldn't it be fun to have like a cartoon character that's kind of like in this D&D inspired space and like tell stories around that. Um, so I came to this like Raven character and started to like sketch out some designs. This was kind of like one of the first, pretty rough, and there's like stuff that I was still figuring out. And then I started to tie it down more, kind of figured out like how I wanted to um, rig the collar so that like it was easier to animate. Um, Also, like kind of thinking about the old like Hanna Barbera cartoons
Yeah,
where
the
they've
Yogi
got like
Bear sort of. You have
yeah,
a naked bear, but there's a collar, and
yeah,
that makes it a lot easier to animate the head.
yeah, exactly. So little things like that, I think just like make for a more like enjoyable rig to animate at the end of the day. So and yeah, I didn't have any like producers like telling me what I could or couldn't do. So yeah, it was just like having fun with it. Then started to figure out color. This was like one of my first passes at it. Um, a little bit like darker, and then I landed on this. Kind of brightened the colors a little bit, and then once I had the design down, that's when you have to get into more of like the technical side of design to prep it for rigging. So you go into the turnaround phase. So yeah, just like taking the one drawing view that I did, figuring out how this character is going to look, the front view, quarter front, profile, and all the way around. Um, because yeah, when you're animating the character, sometimes they're going to be facing different directions, or they're going to turn their head or their body during the scene. And you need to have that rigged into the character puppet so that like the animator knows what it's going to look like. They've got that posed out already.
I just want to pause for a second and just say, like, you have the legs like behind the center of mass, right? Sort of behind his uh, sort of torso, and that
Mm.
very much gives him like a very bird silhouette, very bird sort of posture.
Yeah,
And you don't
yeah,
see that from the front view, which I think is a really cool detail that you sort of have as it rotates.
yeah. There's some like character designs that they will look really good from like quarter front, but then any other view, they like start to fall apart. Like Homer Simpson, I think is kind of a good example.
You
Like
don't want them facing
never,
front. You don't want
n-
front-facing Simpsons.
never in the front view. Um, Same with like Phineas and Ferb, they like start to fall apart. And like there's a lot of charm to those designs, and they've like got a huge legacy. So I'm not like defaming them at all.
Yeah. No,
But
absolutely. But that is something that you sort of see, like The Simpsons avoids in later seasons.
yeah,
You don't see as many front-facing Simpsons as you do see like from screenshots in like season one or season two, season four.
yeah. So I think like that's one of my personal tastes, I guess, as a designer is like I want a character that looks appealing from every angle because like it it kind of sucks in animation when you are too restricted to like, oh, well, they can only ever be in one view. So I try and like think about like, okay, even in the profile view, which is notoriously an ugly view, how can you make it appealing and like nice to look at? And then I learned this from one of my uh, character design instructors, Austin Rankins. He said, you always want to put your character design into a GIF or your like turn around into a GIF because it lets you like see it rotate. ahead of like going into, animation or rigging, because it just like solidifies like, okay, this character lives in a 3D space, like their forms are moving correctly, nothing's like jumping out at you. Um, and then if you do notice like little issues, you can like fix it before you like finalize things.
Yeah, I just want to say, like, this is a very ambitious character design too for a rig. I mean, you have even with that collar and the sort of cape, the like difference in variation of like the curve of it as it goes over his shoulders. That is not an easy thing to do and keep consistent.
Yeah, that's like cloth, especially in rigging, like it's challenging. And it's one of the things that with this character, I kind of wanted to lean into because there's always stuff that I feel like I want to improve at as a character rigger. And um, yeah, it's like, well, I don't get to play with like this draped, like kind of shawl fabric on most characters. Like it would be fun to work out a way that like feels good and within the rig it's gonna like function the way I need it to. So yeah, I feel like I got it to a pretty good place. It's always stuff where like I know if it was in a full TV production, they might like push back on things. But for my own like personal use, I got it to a place where I was happy with it.
Yeah, I think it's a really impressive design.
Thanks. Yeah, and then you don't always get this on TV productions, but like having hand model sheet is nice. um, yeah, just it's all going to be baked into the puppet. So if the animators have that, just means like things are going to stay on model more consistently, and like when possible, the animators can just like flip through to a hand they need for the scene, or just like adjust an existing hand for what they need versus having to like redraw it every single time.
Yeah, I think it's also worth noting too, like you're making a character who's a wizard who's holding a staff, right? You're going to see that hand in a lot of different positions,
Yeah,
holding on to things or doing different poses because, hey, a wizard, uh, wiggling your fingers is kind of part of magic, apparently.
yeah, exactly. And then yeah, some mouth model sheets for like you want to usually have at least happy and sad mouths. I've seen some shows where they'll do like more of a neutral mouth as well, but I already knew that like doing a beak model sheet for the mouth was going to be a challenge, so I just left it at the two, and I think it works. And then yeah, some like expressions as well for the character. So yeah, um, once I did all those, then I feel like I'm prepped enough to actually take it into Harmony and like start building the puppet. Because you need like all those things to actually like make a rig that is going to function the way you want it to.
Yeah, I just want to say the amount of detail too in like the control panel is wild. Um, and I think this is like a really, really ambitious rig.
Yeah, I think like the part that I was most uncertain about was the lighting, because I mean lighting in general you don't tend to see on Harmony rigs. I've done it like a few times, and it you can make it work, but like it just adds a lot of time to TV shows, so they tend to just say like we're going to do that in post. Um, but I wanted to like just try it and see if I could find a way to do it that like felt um, good and like not too cumbersome on the animators. Like, yeah, so the way I kind of handled it for this character is like, I baked the lighting into each pose. So like you don't have to tweak it too much like from the start. And then I tried to add in like some controllers that would give you, yeah, some more like control over the lighting. So I added this like brightness controller. So if you want to like dim out the lighting. You can get rid of it entirely.
What was your approach to lighting? Are you using like the character sort of cut by itself, or are you using separate shapes and lines?
Yeah, so the lighting is like its own drawing shape,
Oh, nice.
and there's deformers on them, so you can like tweak it pretty easily. And then I also made it so that like you can swap between like a shadow version and like a highlight version of the character. Obviously, it looks kind of weird in OpenGL, but if you go to render, then like it's blended so that it looks a little bit nicer.
Oh, that is wild.
Yeah. And then I think this is probably one of the main reasons why like people avoid lighting for character rigs is like you have like a patch on an arm here. And it works fine when you don't have a shadow involved, but as soon as you add like these shadow pieces, you can end up getting like an anti-aliasing around the patch. Um, so I managed to like figure out a way to soften it enough so that like when it's rendered, you don't see it at all, and that felt like
Oh, that's really clever.
yeah. Um, yeah, and then a lot of the things that like just make quality of life for animation a little bit easier. You got head rotation, upper body, lower body.
So these are master controller sliders that you've posed out.
Yeah, yeah. If you like scroll through the timeline, you can see like all the poses that went into making those controllers. Um, yeah, I think that's like actually a good spot to kind of like highlight. So people always show off like the head tilt controllers, and those are probably the ones that get the most attention because they are really fancy and like they make the 2D puppet look really three
It's an
dimensional.
impressive demo.
Yeah, and so if people like see that and they're like, how the hell do you do that? Um, it's just like posing out the head turn like in each angle. So I did like a downward tilt um, for these angles, and then the neutral tilt for all those, and then an up tilt for all those. And then when you plug those into the master controller, you get something like this.
Yeah, it does math and finds the halfway point between the poses, which it blows my mind that it works.
Yeah.
But it's important to note that like that isn't animation, that is posing.
Yes.
An
Yeah.
animator would use that as like a tool to quickly get a pose, and they can refine the pose to get exactly what they want.
Yeah.
But the master controller itself is not animation.
Yeah. And like I think the master controllers are really good at just helping with subtlety. So yeah, if you like want to just add like a little bit more nuance to the scene, like being able to tilt the head down just like a little bit like that is really nice. But yeah, like you said, it's not doing the animation work for the
And
animator.
I think it's also really important to note too, it is not 3D. It is entirely like 2D geometry.
Yeah.
And it is mind bending that you can have like a character with a beak move around with a slider sort of toggling between poses.
Mhm.
But it's a very, very effective effect.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Um, yeah, and then like obviously there's blinks like you would want, and then got our mouth charts baked into the character. then I always think it's super important to show people the node view. Um, I
Hey,
don't know it.
backdrops.
Yeah, backdrops, making it look clean and tidy. I don't know any rigger who like doesn't like to see a clean node view. Um, when I've looked at like people applying for rigging positions, it's always something that I really like prioritize in seeing, because as a character rigger, it's like just very important to know that you're not the only one looking at the character rig and the node view. Once you finish it, it gets handed off to animators who probably will look in the node view and need to know where stuff is. And then effects people will also need to look in there. Comp people, like there's just a myriad of um, parts of the pipeline that are going to be touching it and looking in it. And if you've got like a spaghetti mess of nodes and cables, like no one's going to enjoy working on that rig or like having to touch it.
Or even if like you need to go back and fix something, right? Like let's say
Yeah.
you find out that in a certain pose, a piece clips the wrong way, it doesn't look nice, you need to fix it.
Mhm.
Where is it?
Yeah,
If
exactly.
you can't immediately find it, that's a problem. But also like having empathy for other people in the production too is really
Mhm.
important because someone else is gonna have to use it afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like I've like OCD about my node view. Like I go a little bit further than even what most riggers do. But yeah, I just like to have everything really like clean. It also helps me like because you obviously run into problems when you're rigging where something's not working properly. And when like the nodes are kind of structured in a clean way, it just helps you to be like, okay, this is where this thing's happening. This is what's plugged into what. And then you can kind of like more easily take a step back, look at everything, and then figure out how to solve whatever's going wrong. And yeah, for me, that even includes just like I'll open up these so that I can see like which piece is which more easily than like if everything's just like collapsed. Um, and then yeah, like the backdrops, like you said, I really like backdrops. I know some people don't use them, but like I think it's just whenever you can make it more clear as to like where things are, what is doing what, I think it's really helpful.
Hey, this is an arm, this is a leg, these are
Yeah,
separate.
yeah.
No, I
Um,
think this looks super clean and readable.
Thanks. Yeah. There's also stuff that like is kind of studio to studio um, productions handle things differently, but yeah, you start to like pick up things that you recognize work well for productions, and then I've tried to like keep those on the rigs that I make for myself. One thing we kind of figured out worked well a long time ago was putting a transformation gate um, above wherever your prop is going to be that the character will be holding, because then you can use this node to like easily switch hands for like the prop, and it just like sped up animation quite a bit. So trying to include stuff like that.
So you're not like fiddling around with depth in the middle of a scene. You just have a switch
Yeah,
that's a little bit easier to deal with.
and then you just have one prop too. Like you don't have to have two props in the scene that you're like turning off
Prop
one.
A, prop B.
Yeah, yeah. So it just makes that like a lot easier. Um, yeah, and then in terms of the character, this is something that like again is kind of just case by case. I know some animators they want to see like only drawing substitutions, and then some animators are like, no, I just want deformations on everything. Um, so I tend to lean towards that where I'm like, if there's a deformer on it, that's great. It makes the animator's job easier. And if they don't like that, they can like bake it out and then just redraw off that shape. So I tend to lean into like more deformers on the character. So if I like select this whole guy, you're gonna see how crazy it gets.
In terms of like complexity and like heaviness, how complex would you say this rig is compared to the stuff that you do in your day job?
I think it's a little more complex. Definitely with the lighting stuff, it like that's probably something that most production rigs aren't even going to think about adding on. But there have been a few productions where I'm like, oh yeah, this is on par with that. Um, so yeah, it just depends on like what uh, the show is after and like what style of animation they're looking for. I think more deformer heavy rigs are good for animation that's going to be more subtle. If you're wanting to do more like snappy animation, then maybe you want to lean into more drawing substitutions. But yeah, every production kind of varies, and then when you start off on the production, they'll rig it one way, and then halfway through, you're changing stuff and kind of adapting to what the animation crews want.
Yeah. I will say, like, of the rigs that I've seen, you do see like lighting on rigs occasionally. They
Mhm.
tend to be simpler rigs, though. This
Yeah.
is a pretty like complex and like very like I said, like the volumes are very well defined,
Mm.
and that makes lighting it more complicated.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fair. um, I'm trying to think about like what other things I can.
I noticed there are a lot of handles on this rig too.
Yeah, thanks. That's what I should show. Yeah, the handles. I see some riggers they label handles. I don't know. I guess it's just a preference of mine. I like to just keep it like, just make it a big shape, and then the animators can like select it easily.
Hmm.
So yeah, these handles are for like the eyelids. Goes down and
Those are
gets
great.
that lower eyelid. Like to include like an eye detail or like face detail. So I usually just throw that onto a handle so that like you can hide it easily and then pop it on when you've got like character making an expression. So like over here, you can kind of see it pops on for that. We've got like a cheek. And then try and also like include handles for areas where there's like a cutter, especially when it's just like a line. It's kind of annoying for the animator to just like have to narrow in on like this tiny little detail to select. So if you just make a handle for that, it makes it easier to grab it.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And handles for patches, obviously.
It seems like you put a lot of thought too into like what an animator would have to use frequently on this rig, with your handles.
Yeah, I think like working on so many TV productions, you just like realize how quick animators have to be. And so if you're making their job harder, it's gonna like slow down like every animator times like however many scenes they're working on times however many characters. So you just like want to try and reduce that as much as possible. And you know, as I'm sure most riggers have encountered, when you first start out, you make a few bad rigs and then you never hear the end of it. Like you just, yeah, you want to make sure that like, okay, the rig's being handed off to the animation team, and like if you hear nothing from them, that's like honestly really good. And if you're hearing like people say, "Oh, this isn't working," or "This broke on me," then it's like, okay, I need to revisit things.
Yeah. But I think feedback can be really helpful too, because it's how you grow. You know, if you do the same thing over and over again with no inputs, you're not really changing.
Mhm.
So one thing I want to ask you, like with that in mind, What did you find like the most challenging or interesting when like adapting your character design to the rig?
Yeah, I think like a part of it was the lighting that is always a challenge. Um, like I mentioned with like the elbow joints and stuff. But then aside from that, I think when I rigged the face, I was like, oh, why did I do a bird character? Like a beak is so much more difficult than like just doing a human mouth. Um, so that
I
definitely
also heard
added
too,
like
like on rigs, having like a long sort of snout or face can be challenging, especially if you do have like a very anatomical style.
yeah. Yeah, you have to like think a lot more, I guess, about how it looks in each pose. Because yeah, if it looks off in like the front view or something, like it just starts to fall apart. Um, and yeah, especially with like a really long protruding beak, like it makes it more difficult to figure out a way to deform like this drawing to this drawing, which is
Mm.
why I didn't do that. I made a separate drawing for this beak.
No, that's definitely a clever solution.
Yeah, that's
So one thing I wanted to ask you too before we move on is the clip that I saw that you shared with Fetchin featured him in a scene where he's holding up a staff. The staff glows.
mhm.
So you were doing the character design, the rigging, the animation, effects, a lot, and it looked fantastic.
Oh, thanks. Um,
Uh,
yeah, I can try and show that actually.
it's such a great scene too.
I don't know if the audio is going to come through, but um,
The expressions are fantastic.
thanks. Yeah, it's one of the things like when you make a character to actually get to bring them to life is like the most satisfying part. So yeah, when I actually got to animate with the rig, I was like, oh, this this is what it was all for, basically.
Yeah, so Vagrants of the Shore is a pretty funny like name for a spoof, you know. It to me it sort of evokes like Wizards of the Coast. You've got a character who's a
Mhm.
wizard. Um so do you have like other characters that you sort of have in the setting that you're working on or thinking about?
Yeah, I feel like whenever I start something, like it starts kind of small, and then I start to build like a world around it, and start to think about more characters. So definitely have like um, some more characters that I would like to build eventually. This little rogue raccoon and the gray wolf fighter. So yeah, the goal is like eventually do all the same things that I did for Fetchin. I'll do the turnarounds and expressions and mouth sheets and stuff, and then build them in harmony. Um, and yeah, I think like I've always had the desire and like dream to make cartoons, like not just for like the big studios, but also for myself. And I recently just had the opportunity where I had the time on my hands to make something, and I had this character rig sitting around, and I was like, why am I not like putting my time into this? Because I keep on telling myself that I want to make stuff, and now's your chance. Like this is as good a time as ever. Um, I think part of the thing that is always going to hold you back is just like uncertainty and like the time commitment. Like it's a lot of work to put in for any amount of animation, but especially for like what I was thinking I wanted to do. And there's like the barrier of um, parts of the production that I never tackled before. So I haven't really done background design before. So I was like, okay, I guess I'm gonna learn how to do this now. Um, and I kind of just like picked up pieces of knowledge that I'd learned from like designers that I'd worked with before. And so you think about like layering elements, like how to, um, yeah, just like manage the BG so that it like works well in the scene for the animators, um, and like
I will say
thinking about
one thing you don't
color
see
and
in a lot
stuff.
of like dungeons, right? Are wooden cross beams above. People don't really think about like the construction of like how is this built. So I think that's a cool detail that adds a little bit of like perspective to it.
Thanks. Yeah, that's like if there's like one thing I've learned from designers that I look up to is like they're always thinking about like the little details, and it's like the stuff that you don't even like think about necessarily, but when it's there you're like, "Oh yeah, this feels like a space that like thought has been put behind," and like it just like makes the world feel more real. So I still feel like I'm trying to get better at that, but yeah, designers who work um, in the professional space are consistently thinking about that, and it's I think a really important detail.
Also, did you sneak a Dragon Ball into the treasure hoard?
Yeah, I sure did.
Okay, just checking.
Yeah. Um, yeah, there's another BG from the scene.
That's gorgeous.
Thanks.
So another question I wanted to ask you was, how did your approach to rigging change throughout your career?
Yeah. I feel like it's changed a lot. I think like when you start in rigging, at least this was true for me, and I've noticed juniors tend to do this as well. Is like you lean into just like everything that the software can do, and like trying to use like all the bells and whistles. And as you like progress in rigging, you start to realize like, okay, this is really important to use because like it's going to make the animators' lives easier, and like maybe these features are just like too complicated for them, like without really spending a lot of time with each animator and setting them down and saying like, okay, this is how this works, which you don't often have the time for. It's better to just like keep things simpler. Um, and like the one thing that I notice a lot of beginner rigs fall into, like the issue is like using too many cutters and masks
Mm.
and not realizing like how to use them in an effective way. Um, yeah, I was certainly guilty of it, where it was like, okay, this rig make this mask makes the rig look like the design, but when you try and use the rig, the mask is getting in the way of like making it functional. Like it just ends up breaking things. So you just get better at like, okay, this is a good spot to use a cutter where it's gonna like work well and it's not gonna break anything.
Yeah, I think that discipline too, like, and the confidence of like I don't need to throw in every single bell and whistle to make the rig functional, um, is a good sign of growth too.
Mhm. It's also like sometimes just a time thing. Like sometimes you
Yeah.
do want to put that stuff in, but you're like, well, I've got to finish this by Friday, and there's just no time.
As someone with a creative career, do you have advice for staying motivated to work on projects in your spare time?
Yeah, um, it's really difficult because I feel like I'm not usually good at that when I'm working a 9 to 5. Like it is really difficult to stay motivated to work on your own stuff. Um, I think like the best thing that I can say is just like try not to get burnt out from that 9 to 5 job. Like, if they're forcing you to do overtime, or if you're just doing overtime because you like feel like you have to, like try and resist that. Like, make sure that you've got like a healthy balance between like your job and your personal life. Because when I've been in positions where, yeah, I'm like not just working 8 hours, it's turning into like 10, 12 hour days. I like just no one is going to have the energy after all that to work on their own stuff and feel creatively inspired still. Um, so yeah, just like keeping that balance, I think, is really important.
You're also not going to be producing your best work at like hour 8, 9,
Yeah,
10 of a
yeah,
job.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and I think a lot of like junior artists and people early in their career might not think that they can even advocate for themselves or think about
Mm,
like burnout. It's sort of just like, well, you gotta um, work as hard as you can for as long as you can. And
yeah.
I think thinking of like, hey, you have to sustain your life. Like your work has to be able to sustain you. This is a job.
Mm,
Um, like the production's lucky to have you.
yeah,
Because I
exactly.
really think that like artists contribute a lot.
Yeah.
Um, and it's not I think there tends to be an idea that like, oh, you get to do your dream job,
Hmm.
but it's still a job. You
Yeah.
still have to uh, have boundaries, and
Yeah.
I think that's part of professionalism too.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think that's really true too. Like, as you go along in your career, you start to look at the jobs like less as like, oh, well, this is like a really big name production versus like, oh, this is going to be a really fun team to work with. And like the deadlines are reasonable. And like, yeah, I'm not going to be clocking in like a ton of overtime. Like, those tend to be the jobs that are way more appealing than like, hey, this is like, I don't know, a Disney production. Like, you tend to care about that less as you like get further into your career.
Speaking of careers, like what skills do you think are really important for artists who are interested in pursuing character design and rigging?
um I think like most stuff, like watch your favorite cartoons, like start to like analyze why, for character design, like why they've made certain choices. um Usually with TV animation, it's all about like making the most efficient design. um so like, yeah, less detail, um and trying to just, yeah, think about like efficiency. So when the animators get it, they're not like spending a ton of time on like unnecessary detail. They're just like thinking about the movement of the character and like how it's going to look. And I think that's like similar with rigging too. Like, um, yeah, if you're like interested in getting into rigging, like download a tutorial for Harmony, like, or download the free trial and just like start to explore it, get your feet wet. There's way more content online to learn how to do this stuff than there was even 5 years ago. And I think that's like a huge asset for people who are trying to break in. I feel like younger and younger people, like they're starting out the gate with like professional quality work, which is crazy. But yeah, it's true. They are just like learning everything that they need to online, and then they show up at a studio and they already basically know what they're doing. Um, so yeah, just like try and soak in as much that you can from what's out there. There's definitely some really good resources, including
Oh,
like
for
what's
sure.
on the Toon Boom channel. So
Learn.toonboom.com.
yeah.
Um, we had a question from the chat. Skablooey is asking, well, first commenting that the turnaround GIF was something they hadn't seen before. Do you have other advice for people who are looking at like rigs and turnarounds, like what they can do to make sure their volumes are consistent and that things work well?
Mm. Yeah, I think like, um I don't know. I think it's just like, again, trying to keep things simple. Um and yeah, if you're designing the character, like, yeah, seeing what they look like in 3D space will give you a better idea of like if it's going to function well as a rig. Um, and when you go into rigging, like, it just makes it easier to like uh, pose stuff out from like this view to this view. Um, you can use like the poses that you started out with to like in between.
Yeah.
Um, if that makes sense, I don't know.
It does. I mean, like it goes back to the principles of animation of like volumes, right? Like what are um the 3D shapes that are sort of like underneath the 2D character
Mhm.
that you're making.
Yeah.
And thinking about like, spheres, cylinders, cones, because it all breaks down to that eventually.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If you look at Mickey Mouse, like he's just spheres and
Mhm.
cylinders.
Sort of the classical construction animated characters. Seth, I have one very important question remaining for you.
Mhm.
Where can our audience go to see more of your work across the web?
Sure. Yeah, I'm on Instagram. It's just my name, Seth Lanki. Or I've been posting more on TikTok uh, under Tuna Tiger Hobbs. So you can see me there, and on YouTube as well. It's the same handle. And yeah, I'm trying to post more, make more animated stuff, and the characters that I showed earlier, um, as I like color them and make turnarounds and like rig them and stuff, I'll be updating that. So it'd be great if you could check that out.
I'm going to sneak one more question in here.
Sure.
Seth, why do you think animation artists are drawn to Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop role-playing games?
Yeah. That's a good question too. I think like yeah, it's we're all kind of nerdy. I mean that like in the best way, but like every animator that I've known is like really into storytelling, and like they always have like their personal project on the side that they've got like a cast of characters that they've drawn and designed, and they've got a whole world built around them. I think D&D is really a space that people go to where they can like uh, just explore that even more, especially with friends and stuff. Like you just feel like it's an area where you're not going to feel like judged. You get to play together in a really fun way, and like it's this shared imagination and storytelling. And I don't know. I think that's just like something you don't really see in any other game. Um, and there's something just really special about it. And it's, I think, the reason why it's like D&D's lasted for so long and like maintained its existence in pop culture.
Yeah, I think there's something also very collaborative about it. There's
Mhm.
even if you're the dungeon master and you've got a whole bunch of things prepped, you don't know what your players are going to do. So you're always on your toes. You're always improvising a little bit, no matter what's at the table you're on.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's fun when like stuff goes wrong too. Like you roll a nat one and like it sucks, but like everyone's kind of excited to see what's going to happen.
Yeah, yeah. Or there's a big red button that says "Do not press," and you have the one character who's sort of sidling up to it, and
Yeah.
you know they're going to press it.
Yeah. Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Seth, for taking us on a tour of Fetchin's rig. And thank you to our audience for taking time to join us for today's Rig Show and Tell. Artists can visit toonboom.com for a 21-day trial of Harmony Premium. And Harmony 24 is worth checking out for new features which support hybrid 2D, 3D productions. Coming up on Thursday, August 29th, we have a studio tour interview with Iron Circus Animation. It's a new studio from Iron Circus Comics and the makers of the Lackadaisy animated series. If you want to know more about the business behind independent animation, you won't want to miss it. So thank you so much for taking time to watch, and be sure to tune in next time.